Good morning, folks. Today we are continuing our conversation about virtue ethics. We're going to mostly be focusing on the objections to virtue ethics part of the chapter, where the author will talk about some of the objections that critics have to virtue ethics. I will talk about some of the ways in which a virtue ethicist may respond to those criticisms. Now, just for a little bit of review's sake, recall that the reason why virtue ethics is a pluralistic ethical model is because there is not one absolute fundamental rule that can never be broken. Instead, virtue ethics says that when we're doing our moral decision making, what we should do is consider what I prefer to call a set of values. I prefer to call them values. These are what we call virtues. Now, virtues refer to what we would call character trait excellences. Now, some of the ones that we already talked about, I'll go for the easy ones. Courage, moderation, generosity, industry, industriousness. Now, you'll notice that these virtues embody ways that we go about treating ourselves, but they also extend to how we interact with other people. What Aristotelian virtue ethics contends is that the person who has virtuous character traits possesses what the author and Aristotle refer to as practical wisdom. And practical wisdom refers to the virtues and the experience to handle new problems in life when we are confronted with them. To handle new problems. The virtuous person will have a better idea about how to ethically respond than a person who lacks those virtues. And by the way, folks, those who lack the virtues are vicious. There's two kinds of vices that the author didn't fully expound upon. The vice of excess, which literally is like having too much of a good thing, and deficiency. Now, the courageous person has just the right amount of this particular character trait. And by the way, courage is difficult to define. It's easier to define by example and also by talking about what it isn't. A person with too much courage might be described as foolhardy. The foolhardy person has plenty of courage, but doesn't have the rationality to pull back on that courage. Because simply because you're motivated to do something does not mean that it's wise to do something. When Aristotle speaks of courage, he speaks of the example of the soldier. The soldier with too much courage is liable to get himself killed and his battle buddies. Because sometimes the fight, if it's a losing battle, is likely one that you would be wiser not to fight. In other words, courage sometimes means, not going into battle. Now, the person who lacks courage, we call cowardly. Now, you'll notice that the cowardly person is typically not looked upon favorably. And the author of the text talks about this. To some extent, we feel sorry for people who are not virtuous because we recognize that they are lacking something. And most of us also acknowledge that some of our ability to attain the virtues is largely a matter of what Aristotle and the author refer to as moral luck. Some people are, due to the genetic lottery, more likely to be slightly more equipped to be virtuous and perhaps already more virtuous by nature. If you're not more virtuous by nature, no matter for that, we'll still hold you accountable. Because once you understand what the virtues are, it behooves you to try to attain them in your life. And this is because you will live a better life if you become virtuous. This is part of why the author talks about why virtue ethics, this is one of its strengths. Its motivation for getting us to be moral is sort of implicit. The reason why you ought to want to become virtuous is because you will live a better life for it. You will be more capable of, and this is where we left off last time. It is a prerequisite for what Aristotle called eudaimonia. This is a word that translates to happiness in plain English. But Aristotle was no banal hedonist. As a matter of fact, Aristotle saw happiness as living a fully lived life, what I like to call an exuberant life. The kind of person who's most likely to achieve this is a well-rounded person. A well-rounded person. By the way, a well-rounded person tries all kinds of things, is unafraid to try new things and fail, because we sometimes learn the best lessons from our failures. Now let me tie something in here. If you find a virtuous person, this is a little bit of review, you should listen to them. Because that virtuous person has likely become virtuous by a long meandering process of trial and error. In other words, he's probably failed as often as he's succeeded and had the wisdom to learn from his failures. Now, the virtuous person likely will not have all of the answers. And this goes along with a criticism that the author talked about. People who we acknowledge as virtuous people might not agree on everything. They might not even 100% agree on how a difficult moral quandary ought to be dealt with. But their positions are still worth listening to, even if they do disagree. Because as I will put it, maybe there is no quote-unquote right solution with a capital R. Perhaps there are an array of virtuous ways of responding to moral dilemmas. Virtuous people are aware of that and humble enough to know that they don't have all the answers. It's the reason why we consider humility to be a virtue. Vanity is not. Because the vain person does not acknowledge his limitations, does not acknowledge his failures, and is incapable of learning anything, really. And this is why we rightly feel how about arrogant people. Most of us don't like them. Some of us actually, in a weird way, feel sorry for such people because we know that they are missing something. But anyway, I better not go off on this too much. It doesn't matter that virtuous people sometimes disagree, according to the author, because there may not be just one right way to approach a dilemma. There are ways that might be worse than others, but there may not be a right way with a capital R. Now, one thing I like about this approach, as opposed to some of those monistic approaches from earlier, I think that actually faces moral complexity fairly well by acknowledging that there may not be one right answer. However, some answers are certainly better than others. When people who I regard as virtuous disagree, I listen to all of them. And then I try to weigh on my own what sounds like good sound advice. Now, of course, in order to do that, maybe you're possessing more of the virtues than you think you are. But anyway, I'll move on. That was a little bit of synopsis and review. Objections. I'm going to run through these summarily. The first one the author talks about is tragic dilemmas. And hopefully you looked at that question at the end of the chapter. A tragic dilemma refers to a situation where no matter how you slice it, it seems like there's no moral answer to the problem. The old cliche is damned if you do, damned if you don't. Now, the example the author gave was from a famous novel turned into a Hollywood film starring Meryl Streep. It's called Sophie's Choice. Some of you have probably heard of the book and seen the film, although it's getting a little older now, understandably. The woman was in a quintessential tragic dilemma. I mean, this is Nazis in the Holocaust situation. Both of her children have been taken away. And she is given the choice. One of the children has to be, has to be murdered. One of them has to die. If she doesn't make a choice, both of them will die. This is a tragic dilemma. It would seem that if she chooses one of her daughters to die, that it would be immoral. It would seem if she would choose the other daughter to die, it would still be equally immoral. This is a quintessential case of what the author means by a tragic dilemma. Some of us don't think that this is actually a problem for virtue ethics. Virtue ethics would acknowledge that such tragic dilemmas exist, and that there may not be a right choice, except there is a right choice. Not to do anything at all would be not virtuous. To do nothing at all would be vicious. Because the virtuous person faces life head-on with courage, recognizing that if she makes no choice at all, that both of them will be killed. It is better to save one than to have both of them killed. She has no other choice. Now, indeed, when she chooses one over the other, there will be regret. But guess what? Morally mature people understand that sometimes we can do what we believe is the best we can do in a tragic dilemma and still feel regret for it. Now, the other point that the author makes about tragic dilemmas like this is that once something like this happens to you, it is hard to conceive of such a life being defined as one of these by an outside observer. And you know what? That's probably true. Indeed, a life that was generally going well and well-lived can be totally undermined by a tragic dilemma like this one. That's just how life is. And I don't think any other ethical theory can deal with it any better. The best we can do is to have the courage to deal with life on, the cliche about life's terms. Face life on life's terms, do the best we can with it, accept that certain things are just going to happen that we couldn't do anything about, but to do the best we can in these situations. Indeed, it also takes the virtue of courage to move on after something like this. And some of us would say that's what a morally mature person ought to do. Because if we get consumed by grief, not that that's easy, not that it's easy not to be consumed by grief, but in the end, your life is likely to go very badly if you allow grief to take hold of you. Virtuous people understand that they have some role in their happiness. Or I should say, at least some role in their avoiding radical unhappiness. Yeah, Mr. Dukes.
Would a utilitarian theory handle that Sophie's choice?
Well, the utilitarian would have a problem with it. And here's part of why. Remember, utilitarianism is all about what? The greatest happiness. I don't know how either of those choices would enhance the greater happiness. And by the way, the greater happiness principle often asks you to be impartial. Well, if you're being impartial when it comes to your children, you would end up morally paralyzed. How do you choose between your two children? Well, the sad fact is, most of us would choose between our two children. The problem is, we lie to ourselves when we say that we do not have some favorite. We lie to ourselves. And that's a sad fact, but guess what? Perhaps it takes a little bit of moral maturity to look yourself in the mirror and to acknowledge these things. But yeah, I'm pretty sure my wife's got a favorite, even though she would never admit it. And granted, it's probably because her son is a spitting image of her. They look very genetically similar. My daughter she looks like the female version of me 25 years ago. And I imagine some of that plays a role. And is that a bias? Heck yes, it's a bias. But it's perhaps a bias that, we really can't avoid. And this is one of the reasons why, and this is totally unrelated, but it's an example. This is one of the reasons why people tend to have more love for their spawn, for their spawn. Because of that biological link. Not that that's necessarily a good thing, it just might be a biological fact. Some people think it is a good thing because it sort of gives us a motivation to quote unquote love our children and to do as well by them as we can. But I'll be quiet about that. Now, the author of the text talks about, does virtue ethics offer adequate moral guidance? Now, according to virtue ethics, our moral guide is to find a what? You find a moral exemplar, and you do the best you can to learn from them and emulate them. But as I said before, what if two people who would count as moral exemplars would respond differently? Which one do you trust? Now, another sort of problem related to this is, well, I'll wait because it's related to the priority process. The author talks about the problem about determining who your exemplars are. How do you know who counts as a moral exemplar? And if you do know who counts as a moral exemplar, it would seem to suggest that you yourself already know enough about virtue to be able to make that decision. If you completely know nothing at all, you would have difficulty determining who a moral exemplar would be. Well, guess what? Aristotle would not buy this rebuttal. He says, even if you are not virtuous yourself, as an observer, you could tell, roughly speaking, who's virtuous and who's not. Because a virtuous person will be more this. This is my word. A virtuous person is likely to be an effective human being. And by that, I mean a person who lives a pretty darn good life, deals with life pretty well on life's terms, does pretty darn well. Now, this doesn't mean that all people who are effective are moral exemplars, because the fact is, there's plenty of people who can fake it till they make it. And this is where the author made the distinction between virtue and continence. How many of you saw that? He says, virtuous people are not merely continent. Now, a person who is continent refers to a person who, even though they lack virtue, appears to do a pretty darn good job of holding it together. I know plenty of people like that. As a matter of fact, I work with some people like that. Seriously. In other words, lack virtue, but they seem to get on pretty well in life. But if you talk to them enough, you find out that they're internally in pieces. And that their lives only appear to be run in virtuous ways. I don't want to name any names. It's not me, though. Although I certainly wouldn't call myself virtuous either. I would say most of my life has been spent holding my you-know-what together. And this is because life's what? Yeah, when you have a million things firing at you all at once, and you're working most of the time, you don't have a whole lot of time to, slow down, contemplate, etc. This is why becoming virtuous is to some extent, I would say, a luxury item. Because you kind of have to have enough time to sit back and reflect, on life in order to develop these traits. This is why we wouldn't expect what kind of a person to be virtuous. Yeah, can't expect a young person to be virtuous. They haven't had the kind of time or experience. This is why whenever we meet an older person who lacks virtue, we say, what happened to this person? Because we would expect a person who has had the time and experience to at least have learned some meaningful life lessons and to be more effective than they are. There's a cliche about, with age comes wisdom. I think that's wrong. With age ought to come wisdom. Doesn't always happen, but we would expect it more with people who have had life's experiences than people who have had little. And I'll repeat something I said last time. This is why I would never call myself virtuous. I would have a ton of advice to give to my 19-year-old self. I would have a ton of advice to give to my 19-year-old self about the number of times I royally screwed up and wished that I had handled things differently. That's the wisdom of hindsight. Anyway, now, I kind of already alluded to this issue. The author mentions what he calls conflict and contradiction. What if two moral exemplars are in disagreement? Is this a problem for virtue ethics? Aristotle would give you a resounding no. There may be more than one virtuous way to deal with a situation. Remember, this is a pluralistic model. It acknowledges life's complexity. It acknowledges that there may not be one right with a capital R way to deal with the moral dilemma. There may be a range of virtuous ways to deal with a problem. A range. In fact, Aristotle would say on most everyday issues, actual moral exemplars would probably generally agree on things more than they would agree. They would agree more than they would disagree. Sorry. Anyway. The author talks about something called the priority problem as being a potential problem for virtue ethics. We encountered the priority problem about another issue way earlier in the course. Remember when we were discussing divine command theory, and Socrates asked the question, do the gods will it because it's good, or is it good simply because the gods will it? That was an expression of what we call a priority problem. In other words, which one is prior? The virtue or the virtuous person? Now, the critic of virtue ethics says if you look at virtue ethics the way it has been conveyed, it has a priority problem. Because it says that something is virtuous just because virtuous people would comport themselves that way. AKA, the fact that virtuous people do it seems to be what makes it virtuous. Aristotle would chide the author for this. He would say, "You're not understanding me at all. Virtuous people are not what makes the virtues virtues. What makes the virtues virtues is that they are character trait excellences that tend to make people's lives go well." In other words, virtuous people do not create the virtues. The virtues are human excellences that when people possess them, they tend to be able to live more effective lives. So Aristotle would contend there is no such priority problem. That in fact, the virtues are good simply because they are excellent traits for helping humans to live well, to deal with life's challenges, etc., etc. So Aristotle would quickly kick this to the curb. And I confess I happen to agree with him. Now, thoughts and conclusions about virtue ethics. This will be me more than the textbook. Now, if you happen to like those magic bullet kind of approaches to ethics that we were doing earlier, the one where there is a singular principle that you can almost use in a formulaic way, virtue ethics will likely not appeal to you. However, if you're a person who saw those magic bullet ethical monism theories to be limited because of the ways they may have failed to deal with what the author calls moral conflict, and what I mean by moral conflict is something like this. To be a good utilitarian oftentimes meant to kick justice to the curb. Because remember, utilitarianism is all about the greater good. But what do most of us think matters? Justice. Most of us think there's more than one thing that matters. And that's something that pluralistic models do. That's something that virtue ethics does. Instead of giving us what I would call guiding principles, the virtues are like guiding values that can help us to deal with real life situations as well as moral dilemmas. And when I say deal with real life situations, in a way, virtue ethics would contend that everything we face could be considered a moral problem from a virtue point of view. Let me give you an example. Suppose you're a student who dropped the ball at various times during the course. Let's hope I'm not talking about present company. Virtue ethics would actually give you suggestions about virtuous ways to behave in that situation. If you drop the ball, a virtue ethicist would say it's probably best to acknowledge it here and now, recognize that there were probably circumstances that led to it, but don't make excuses. Acknowledge your part in it. That's what morally mature people do. In other words, they accept their agency and then face it head on to try to get through it. What I mean is have the courage. If it means talking to someone and having an uncomfortable conversation, well, guess what? That's what a virtuous person does. In other words, you say, instructor so-and-so, I screwed up royally, and I know it's my fault, but can you at least do me a solid, that kind of thing? I understand that I won't earn full credit, but I would like to at least make the best of a difficult situation. What's the worst that can happen? You might be faced with the sticklers as you screwed up later on. Less exams to grade. But guess what? If you want to succeed in your endeavors, it's a chance worth taking. Big deal. People are so afraid of being embarrassed. And half the time, the people we're afraid of being embarrassed around we'll never see again in our lives. Isn't that the weird irony? that we get so pent up about these things. But of course, when we're faced with it right away, it's something that we can be very scared and nervous about. But in hindsight, it's a drop in the bucket. Yeah, this is why virtue ethics would counsel, you know. Even a situation like that can be seen as a sort of moral dilemma. Because morality is about having character trait excellences that will help you to live a good life. And indeed, your living a better life will help others around you to live a better life too. And even if it's only this, if you do become virtuous, you may become something that I'd like to be at some point. Oh, that's an exemplar. That's an exemplar. Someone could point to and say, hey, his life wasn't perfect, but he did all right. Maybe he's got some lessons that are worth a novice to take notice to. Cheers. Oh, well, cheers on that.
Right.
Now, before we end for today, because we have a little bit of time, I did want to at least introduce the last of the pluralistic theories that we're going to be looking at in this course. We looked at Ross's version in chapter 16. We've looked at Aristotelian virtue ethics. Chapter 18, we are going to take a look at feminist ethics. I want to make a few snide remarks to get us started. Because of our political culture, feminism has been bashed quite a lot in our political culture. It turns out that most people who bash feminism don't even understand feminism in a way that a feminist would convey feminism. I mean, someone who understands it. And by the way, folks, keep in mind also that what is conveyed as political feminism may not be the same thing as feminist ethics. In other words, probably a good starting point for beginning this chapter is try to clear your mind of any preconceptions that you may have about what feminism supposedly is. And then try to read about feminist ethics without prejudice. Because a lot of our politicians are constantly bashing feminism. And from what I've heard them say, they don't even understand what political feminism is, let alone feminist ethics. Because they are related, but they are not one and the same thing. Now, to sum up what the author is talking about regarding the major value of feminism. Remember, feminism, like other pluralism, doesn't give us an absolute moral rule. Instead, I would argue that feminist ethics suggests that there are guiding values. And for those of you who read ahead, the main value of feminist ethics is what we will be referring to as an ethic of, will be an ethics of care. Now, the main figure in feminist ethics that the author refers to, so of course this position is Nell Noddings. We do not have a reading by Nell Noddings, though. Now, the way that the feminist ethics model is explained, and think of this as a model, if you want to have a moral approach to problems, you should express your care in a way similar to the care that a loving mother has for her child or children. In other words, the role of a mother is seen as a sort of moral exemplar in feminist ethics. And I might be giving away too much of an answer to homework questions here. In a way, the loving mother is seen as exemplifying a moral exemplar of sorts. Now keep in mind, when you're reading ahead, feminist ethics will suggest that while impartiality isn't bad in and of itself, that impartiality should not be an ideal. Why? Because when we are impartial, this is me explaining it, not the text. The problem with impartiality in our moral reasoning is it sets the stage for thinking about human beings, not as human beings, but as mere abstractions. You understand what I mean? When we're doing like a trolley car thought experiment, whether we're using utilitarianism or Kantian doctrine of double effects, in a way, we are looking at those problems mathematically. We're supposed to divorce ourselves of the emotions in order to find out what the right point of view is. The problem is, if you start thinking of everything in that way, you cease to think of human beings as human beings. Sometimes impartiality can help us in our moral decision making. Sometimes it may make it easier for us to think of people as mere cogs that don't matter. In other words, impartiality can lead us sometimes to good moral reasoning. Other times, it might lead us to be capable of committing the worst of atrocities. My example, not the textbooks. But do you really think if the Nazis believed that they were killing human beings, that they would have had as much ease in doing it? The answer is no. If they had actually thought of their victims as human beings, it would not have been as easy to do. The same way, if we're engaged in warfare, one of the first things that the soldiers need to learn, and by the way, I don't consider this a good thing, but it's necessary in warfare situations, is the dehumanization of the enemy. You've heard of this, right? Because it's a lot more difficult to kill someone if you actually think that they have status as a human being. Most people by nature do not want to kill. Most people by nature are revolted by the idea of killing. This is why, in a way, people need to be taught to kill. Now, the ethics of care would say, thinking of people as mere cogs or thinking of people as mere numbers is tantamount to dehumanizing them. Now, granted, the ethics of care might end up coming to the same ethical conclusions. Net conclusions as utilitarianism or Kantianism in some cases. But it would suggest that those models are inadequate for a fully morally developed way of looking at problems, because we are dealing with human beings here. We should care about our fellow human beings. In other words, the emotions should be part of our moral equation. Now, this is something similar to what Aristotle said, for those of you who remember the readings. That the emotions, I should say, the well-honed emotions, the experienced emotions, ought to be part of the process of our moral decision-making. Now, our monistic moral theories tended to shun the emotions as things that got in the way, things that led to bias and unclear thinking. These two pluralistic models that we are looking at right now, virtue ethics and feminist ethics, will contend that emotional maturity ought to be part of the moral decision-making process, indeed integral to it. And we will talk more about that next time.